Emile Schrijver also could not make the trip, but he recorded his lecture, and now we are working on trying to establish a channel of communication so that actually we could be able to talk to him. Emile Schrijver is the curator of the Biblioteca Rosataliana in Amsterdam and professor of Jewish book history at the University of Amsterdam. He's also the curator of the private Braginski collection in Zurich, Switzerland. As of October 1st, 2015, very soon, he will be the general director of the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam and leave the Biblioteca Rosataliana. So we are waiting to get, yes. I guess that's one of the reasons why I couldn't make it. He's really very busy. So, okay. So here is his title. It seems that we're getting there. His title is The Decorated Jewish Book Since the Invention of Printing, Shifting Paradigms and New Sources. And here it is. Okay. Good morning. But he's new to it. Okay. Stop talking.
Yes, turn out the overhead light.
They will fix it.
Thank you so much for allowing me to join. Certainly wonderful conference. From very far away, I have to apologize for not being here and for not being able to join you in your conference. I want to thank my friend Adon Bagama, who was kind enough to make this video of my presentation. We're actually in Zurich doing this, and I would also like to thank the organizers for allowing me to share my paper with you, at least in this virtual form. So let me start with what I wanted to share with you, and then we'll continue from there. Jewish book history is more than the history of the Jewish book in the strict sense of the word. In the past half century, the study of the Jewish book has developed from a traditional descriptive bibliographical discipline into an independent field of research, in which the book is studied as an expression of Jewish culture and as an instrument for the transmission of Jewish and non-Jewish knowledge. Foundations for this new field of Jewish book history were laid in medieval book research. In particular, Malachi Beterier and Colette Syrah have defined new fundamental research questions, which are closely related to and often anticipate the current research agenda into non-Jewish medieval books. Their research is based on the study of large corpora of selected primary, mostly dated or signed, source material, but it is not limited to descriptive work. They have produced a considerable number of monographs in which far more most fundamental research questions have been dealt with. And there is Vadata, the online version of the database underlying the Hebrew Paleography project. For the study of the Jewish books in the centuries since the invention of printing, a comparable development may be observed, but the results are not as definitive yet. Part of the reason for this may be the fact that many questions asked by modern researchers of Jewish book history were taken from the broader field of book history, and do not take the peculiarities of the Jewish book into full account. The singularity of the Jewish book can only be understood in full if it is studied in its own cultural and intercultural context. This goes further than a mere application of research questions from the general field of book history to the Jewish book, or a comparison of certain phenomena found in non-Jewish, usually Christian books, with their Jewish counterparts. So I will deal here mainly with Jewish books since the invention of printing, thus excluding the production of Jewish handwritten books, the large majority in Hebrew, before that invention. Such a designation is more appropriate than the classical distinction between medieval and post-medieval Hebrew book production. The invention of printing is one of the late Middle Ages, and in the many centuries since the invention of printing, Jews have never stopped producing manuscripts. A further term that needs to be explained is the word book, Jewish book. It is considered here to comprise both manuscripts and printed books. In fact, all volumes produced by and or for Jews and or with a direct Jewish relevance. Strictly, this definition excludes single sheets items such as decorated and illuminated marriage contracts and printed broadsides, as well as post-medieval Torah scrolls, Esther scrolls and other book scrolls handwritten or printed. Since, however, these items are part of the same Jewish book culture, they cannot be ignored completely. In older literature, the Jewish book has always been subclassified into separate entities, defined by a number of modifiers, handwritten or printed, chronological, geographical, decorated, illustrated, etc. A true understanding of the Jewish book, however, involves a permanent awareness of the complex interrelations between the various techniques, carriers, localities, manufacturers, etc. There's no such thing as the history of Hebrew printed books, just as there is no such thing as the history of Hebrew manuscripts after the invention of printing. Hebrew printed books cannot be understood without understanding the contemporary Hebrew manuscript tradition, just as Hebrew manuscripts after the invention of printing cannot be understood without understanding the Hebrew printing tradition. And there are further dimensions to consider. Hebrew printed books cannot be understood without understanding Jewish books printed in scripts other than Hebrew. And likewise, neither can Hebrew manuscripts after the invention of printing be understood without understanding Jewish manuscript books since the invention of printing in scripts other than Hebrew. An inward-looking perspective is misleading, however, because Jews never lived in isolation. And book culture is never to be understood in isolation, Jewish book culture. Local histories of Hebrew books, printed or handwritten, need to take into consideration the book production, printed or handwritten, of the non-Jewish locale. These cultural interrelations are also important when considering the decoration of text and the use of images in them. Certainly until the 18th century, book illustration and decoration was among the most prominent and widest spread expressions of Jewish art. In sum, the history of the Jewish book is as complex and multifaceted as Jewish history, which is a quote that I take from my colleague David Stern. And let me guide you through a number of examples. In the first half of the 16th century, Venice, where no Hebrew books were printed in the incunable period, became the main center of Hebrew printed book production. Inevitably, the printers of these first Hebrew books were in constant need of manuscripts to print from. They stressed the importance of critical editions based on reliable manuscripts and were aware of the necessity to find these. Born into a family of Antwerp merchants with an interest in printing, Daniel Bomberg, as he is commonly referred to in Jewish sources, was the most influential Christian printer of Hebrew books in Venice. He worked there with some intervals between 1516 and 1549. And among the more than 200 books that he produced are the first complete editions of the Biblia Rabbinica, Migrot Kodalot, Palestinian and Babylonian Talmudim, and important rabbinic text. For his 1522-24 edition of the Palestinian Talmud, he claimed to have used a number of manuscripts in order to achieve the best possible text. It has been proven more than a century ago, however, that this edition was based almost entirely on one manuscript, the manuscript that is now known as the Leiden Yerushalmi. Bomberg's claim, nevertheless, shows a text-critical awareness and sense of editorial and redactional responsibility, and this edition would remain the standard for many generations, even if this high standard was not always reached. Bomberg's was also one of the first printing offices in which Jewish and non-Jewish specialists worked together intensively, an example that would soon be followed in the most important other centers of humanist Hebrew printing, such as Basel, Geneva, Isny, Constance, Paris and Antwerp. The case of the Bomberg edition and the Leiden manuscript of the Palestinian Talmud shows how the intricacies of the transmission of medieval Hebrew manuscripts had an enormous influence on the nature of the printed text, and on its subsequent century-long reception by a worldwide Jewish readership. In his colophon to the original manuscript, which is now kept in Leiden University, and was finished on Thursday, 17 February 1289 in Rome, the scribe of what is today the only extant complete medieval manuscript of the Palestinian Talmud reports, I quote, I, Yechiel, son of Rabbi Yekutiel, son of Rabbi Benjamin Harofeh, of blessed memory, have copied this Talmud Yerushalmi. And I copied it from a corrupt and faulty exemplar, and what I was able to understand and comprehend, I corrected to the best of my knowledge. And I'm fully aware that I didn't reach at all the corruptions and faults I found in that copy, and not even half of them. And may therefore the reader of this book, who will find corruptions and faults therein, judge me according to my merit, and not blame me for all of them. And may the Lord in his mercy forgive me my sins and cleanse me from my errors, as it is said in the Psalms, who can be aware of errors, clear me of unperceived guilt. Unquote. Today, Bomberg's edition of the Palestinian Talmud is as authoritative as it has been since its appearance in the first half of the 16th century. It is, though, very important to realize that this printed text of the Palestinian Talmud is based on a medieval manuscript that its original scribe claimed to have, I quote, corrected to the best of his knowledge. And second, that this owner-edited manuscripts, as all other Hebrew owner-edited manuscripts were, during their lifetime considered authoritative representatives of that particular and appreciated use, that particular text, and appreciated, used, and transmitted as such. This is just one of many possible examples, proving that the production of Hebrew printed books cannot be studied without an understanding of the role of manuscripts. But the opposite is also true. It's obvious that the almost omnipresence of numerous printed copies of Jewish works had an enormous impact on the production of Jewish manuscripts. Why would numerous versions of major rabbinical texts still be copied by hand, if cheaper printed editions were readily available? It is a major misconception, nevertheless, that Hebrew manuscript disappeared completely. To this day, it is common to treat much of the enormous corpus of later manuscripts as derivative and irrelevant, and it's even not uncommon to disregard them. The great Maurice Steinschneider also ranks among the many scholars of the last century and a half who turned a blind eye to the importance and quality of later Hebrew manuscripts. Indeed, besides criticizing the quality of the textual content, he also had little positive to say about the illustrations that appear in these manuscripts. I quote in German from the second volume of his catalogue of Hebrew manuscript at Berlin Staatsbibliothek of 1897. An der Ausschmückung ist eine Mühe verschwendet worden, welche nur von der beispiellosen Geschmacklosigkeit übertroffen wird, die selbst bei einem deutschen Juden des 18. Jahrhunderts überrascht. Ganze Seiten enthalten nur scheußliche Figuren von Menschen, Tieren und anderen Gegenständen, deren Zusammenhang mit dem Buche mitunter sehr fraglich erscheint. He speaks of an unprecedented lack of taste, surprising even for an 18th century Jew. Here Steinschneider is referring to a manuscript written in Germany in the 18th century of a work called Seder HaMoladot, explaining the times of the new months, page 28. The very letter which is the inspiration for this illustration here. Perhaps the angel in the previous illustration is also inspired by the same biblical episode. In post-biblical text, Issachar is described as acquiring knowledge about the calendar in a journey to heaven. The hourglass symbolizes that knowledge. This, combined with the verse in Chronicles 12, in which his tribe is linked to understanding of the times, explains his presence here. Presumably, in this picture, Issachar is already back from his journey to heaven, unlike the earlier picture in the Berlin manuscript, since the hourglass represents the need to pass on his acquired knowledge. So what are at first sight rather naive, even awkward, and certainly unusual illustrations are revealed on closer inspection to offer a relevant addition to the text. Indeed, the picture has a universal significance. And in Elisheva Kalabach's words, they express, I quote, the divine origins of the rabbinic reckoning of time, the priority and superiority of the Jewish calendar, and its place in the chain of transmission of the Jewish tradition. Unquote. So what was Maurice Steinschneider's perspective? My Amsterdam colleague Irene Zwiep published an article in 2010 about what she called the Wissenschaft des Judentums and the visual, in which she discusses Steinschneider's uneasy relationship with Jewish art, both of the medieval period and of subsequent centuries. A number of major exhibitions of Jewish material culture in the closing decades of the 19th century, and the seminal publication about the famous Sarajevo Haggadah by David Kaufman in 1898 had raised the study of what was often tentatively referred to as Jewish art to permanent status in Jewish culture, in cultural history by the turn of the century. Towards the end of his career, therefore, Steinschneider was no longer able to ignore the existence of these forms of Jewish art, and didn't neglect to mention the results of recent research into this art and into Jewish material culture in his last major publications. Nevertheless, he was of a previous era, in which for a variety of reasons art and Judaism did not belong together. Primarily because there was no place for this in contemporary Jewish religious life. Also, because in much of the 19th century, and certainly at the inception of Steinschneider's academic career, art was not a national, but a universal phenomenon. Jewish art was a contradiction in terms for Wissenschaft scholars, and that would change only gradually through the work of later generations, such as David Kaufman and other scholars, such as Martin Buber. Steinschneider had no desire to take a different perspective and was probably incapable of doing so. For him, the study of Jewish text came first, and the study of artistic illustrations, whatever their quality, at best second. Back to the interrelations between printing and manuscripts. Most striking examples of the influence of the Hebrew printing tradition on the production of Hebrew manuscripts are the works of what is known as the Central and Northern European 18th century school of manuscript decoration. These were usually smaller liturgical books that were commissioned by upper and middle class Jews. This revival of Hebrew manuscript decoration was initiated in 1712 by an accomplished Moravian scribe in Vienna, Aryeh ben Yehuda Leib of Trebizond. Between 1712 and 1714 he copied the daily prayer book, which is now in the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. This must be considered the first manuscript produced during the revival. Aryeh ben Yehuda Leib is the first recorded scribe to have written his manuscripts with Amsterdam letters, Beotiot Amsterdam. Title pages of books printed outside of Amsterdam in the late 17th and early 18th century often contained a statement that the books were printed with Amsterdam letters as an indication of quality. These printed books usually have the word Amsterdam printed prominently on the title page, whereas the actual place of printing is printed in much smaller time, or even at the very end of the book, if at all. Aryeh ben Yehuda Leib transposed this custom to manuscripts. As a number of his manuscripts contain images that were printed onto the parchments on which he wrote the text, it can be assumed that he was involved in the printing industry, even though there was no Hebrew printing in Vienna in the period. From Bohemia and Moravia, the fashion spread over southern Germany, Alsace, and northern Germany, whereas the northern Netherlands only joined the picture later in the century. With the exception of a number of manuscripts produced in Rotterdam by the Moravian scribe Nathan ben Shimshon of Mezerich, there almost all manuscripts were produced in the second half of the century. Some 500 manuscripts produced during the 18th century still survive. A number of developments within the Jewish world can be identified as having impacted on the emergence of the luxury book culture. I shall take as an example a signed Haggadah made in 1747 by a certain Israel Sofer of Fürth, near Nuremberg, Bavaria, now at the Bar-Ilan Library in Oxford. This volume is an extraordinary mixture of manuscript and print, reminiscent of the manuscript by Aryeh ben Yehuda Leib of Trebizond, with its printed margin on the intermediate title page, and yet a rather different mixture. The entire text is handwritten. The illustrations, here for example of the sages at Bnei Barak, are all printed, colored by hand and pasted onto the appropriate manuscript page. The source for these images is well known, a Haggadah printed at Wilhelmsdorf, a town with a rich tradition of Hebrew book production, barely 20 kilometers away from Fürth. The printed edition appeared in 1718 and followed the pattern set by the Amsterdam editions of 1695 and 1712. In fact, the decorative material for Hebrew books printed in Wilhelmsdorf actually originated from Fürth. Again, we find the scribe experimenting with form, interested in different techniques, combining two mediums, a handwritten text and printed illustrations, and presumably also a patron interested in the project. Traditional illustrations conforming to norms of contemporary Haggadot, namely that they resemble those of Amsterdam, although here hand-colored and incorporated into a luxurious and doubtless expensive handwritten volume. Where did the hybridity of manuscripts like these come from? Part of the answer is provided by David Oppenheim, chief rabbi of Prague and known as the leading Jewish book collector of the early modern period, whose collection of around 4,200 printed books and 780 handwritten volumes forms the core of the Jewish department of Oxford's Bodleian Library. Oppenheim was a scion of one of the leading families of Bohemian court Jews who lived from 1668 to 1736. His financial resources were ample, and when he turned his attention to building a library of Jewish books, it assumed unprecedented dimensions. American researcher Joshua Teplitsky presented a fine dissertation in 2012 at New York University, in which he devoted 2 chapters to Oppenheim's activities as a collector. He paints a portrait of a rabbi who aimed to gather as many books as possible, who collected books as material culture, who maintained contact with a network of scribes in his later years, who actually wrote by hand a calendar work like the ones we've seen before, and who was especially fond of luxury editions of printed books on colored paper or fine parchment, which he commissioned from printers in southern Germany. Indeed, involving a man like David Oppenheim or some other court Jew in the production of a luxury edition might easily finance an entire print run. One of the leading printers in Sulzbach in Bavaria was Aaron ben Uri Liebman Frenkel. He came from Vienna, where he was extremely well connected with the court Jews. In 1711, he printed a perfectly produced edition of the Haggadah, almost entirely based on the Amsterdam Haggadah of 1695. No less than 5 examples of this edition are found in the Bodleian's Oppenheim collection, of which 3 on parchment. This illustration, based on Exodus 2 verse 12, in which Moses kills an Egyptian who had struck one of the enslaved Hebrews and buries the body, is from one of the parchment editions. Another parchment edition contains the same illustrations, but this time hand-colored. Moreover, this engraving is enclosed in a yellow frame which covers a line of text and distorts the symmetry, perhaps not the primary concern of the perpetrator. Aside from the lack of symmetry, however, it's also clear that the illustration is not exactly in the same position in relation to the text. It is shifted slightly to the left, and the angle is different. Presumably, printing on parchment was not the simplest of techniques, and mistakes were occasionally made. And yet there was no reason not to go to all that trouble. Here too, the uniqueness of the edition is what really mattered. Time to sum up. Apart from the various research topics and angles discussed here already, there are further possible and necessary areas of research of the Jewish book since the invention of printing. The transmission from the 16th to the 19th century of Jewish mystical knowledge, largely through manuscripts, many of these illustrated, and the canonizing of certain Kabbalistic texts through the preparation of printed editions is now beginning to be understood. Connected with that, but not restricted to mystical texts, are ongoing studies of the strategies underlying the circulation of printed books and manuscripts, as well as interventions by various cultural elites. The borrowing of illustrations is an important new topic, both between Jewish printed books and between Jewish and non-Jewish printed books, and between Jewish printed books and Jewish and non-Jewish manuscripts, and between Jewish manuscripts and Jewish and non-Jewish printed books. The study of ephemerical publications is gradually developing, and the emergence of a Jewish press and of journals has now been studied in quite some detail. And likewise, the printing and writing by hand of maps, as well as printing on parchment, tinted papers and textile, mostly silk, has received considerable recent scholarly attention. Other points of view, not necessarily related, need further development but cannot be discussed here. More vital than summing up all these potential areas of research is the realization that further stratification of the study of Jewish book culture is necessary, geographically and chronologically. The goal for the near future should be an attempt to integrate the various histories of Jewish books in order to gain a deeper understanding of the transmission of Jewish knowledge, or information, or images through its various media. This is a massive task, but important first steps have been made already, and promising new research is in preparation, especially in the field of the illustrated Jewish books. I thank you very much for your attention, with a repeated apology, and I can only wish you a successful continuation of your conference. Thank you so much.
We are trying to get back to Emile. We lost him. But we have, when we have 5 minutes, but we can, I guess, add another 5 if we succeed to get him back.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, here he is.
Just yeah. Hi, everybody can hear you at the moment.
Okay, sure, should be careful.
Here. No?
Okay, any questions? I'll slowly, I'll have to put them in the...
Here, you can stand here.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that.
Because then he can see you.
Hi, Emile. Good to see you. Yeah. You are all flabbergasted from the technology, I guess. So am I.
Enjoying it.
Oh no, you didn't do something bad.
He'll be back.
Okay. Eva, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Should I come forward?
I can put it in. Yeah, you can also come forward if you want to. Yeah. Okay, just speak to the mic.
Hello, Emile.
Hi,
It's Eva here. We miss you.
Okay, well, I miss all of you.
It's a bit chilly in Tel Aviv. I'm sorry you're missing it. Thank you very much for your wonderful paper. As usual, I especially enjoyed the meticulous kind of technical details that you showed in Blown Up. It's really quite amazing, and I realized that I just have to go back to the Bar-Ilan quickly and look at some of these. But I wanted to ask you something about where you see the origins of what you called hybridity, and that is things that are somewhere that are, for example, printed with handmade editions, or that are somewhere trying to position themselves somewhere in a kind of a no man's land between the print and the manuscript. And I think the question has two parts. One is a factual question. Where do you see the beginnings, or is there something like beginnings? Is there not hybridity right from the start? Because of the status of the manuscript. And the second question that I have is, do you think that when things are printed on parchment or hand-colored, that there is an aspiration to make it look like a manuscript? And does that mean for you that manuscripts continue to have some kind of a special status in the era of printing, even into the 18th century?
Yeah, well, actually, you've given part of the answer. The hybridity is in the nature of Hebrew books since the invention of printing. We have a couple of examples, not too many, but a couple of examples of books in the incunable period, so before 1501, that have. Do you hear me? You hear me?
Yeah. Very well.
Yeah. Okay. You have books from the 15th century printed before 1501. Where actually the printers decided to leave open the space for the initial word, where the initial word would then be written by hand. So the very first printers of Hebrew books were already aware of this. I haven't mentioned Megillot and Ketubot. There are many examples of Ketubot and Megillot that have printed borders, for example. There are even combinations. There's a beautiful Phoenician Ketubah in the Berginsky collection, used to be in the Gans collection in Amsterdam, that has an interesting combination of drawn images on the one hand and printed images on the other. So all forms of hybridity that you can think of are actually there in the wider Jewish book culture. I mean, there's no doubt about that, and it certainly has to do with the printing, just with the need. I would say with the feeling that people wanted luxurious books. And I think that David Oppenheim is important, because in the 18th century, what happened? I've called it Jewish Baroque in another publication. So there is a genuine interest in lavishness of books that is, I would say, otherwise not present in the period since the invention of printing. So we've seen deluxe printing in Venice, we've seen printing on blue paper in Venice, we've been seeing printing on color papers, but David Oppenheim was really the one who basically made this into a fashion. I mean, we have books in the Bar-Ilan collection printed on yellow paper, on parchment paper, on gray paper, on red paper. He was interested. He was a Jewish bibliophile, but to the extent that it became a bibliomania. And one of the things that I've mentioned elsewhere is that with the production of books like these, the interest for the text changes, and the shape of the book and the outlook of the book, regardless of its content, seems to become more important. When you look at certain Haggadot by the likes of Herling and the famous 18th century Schrijver and a couple of others, one of the first striking things is just that all the mistakes that are in the texts are full of mistakes. There are all sorts of mistakes in the vocalization. That's a thing that would not happen. That would not have happened earlier, not to the extent that one finds in 18th century manuscripts. And I think the reason for that is really the fact that the outer form was becoming more and more important, and I think one can even see that as a step to let's say the disadvantages of modernity. I hope that answers the question. But generally, the hybridity was all over the place from the very beginning of Hebrew printing.
Well, and that is also pretty much going on in Christian culture at the same time, where the two things really run parallel. Any other questions? We have 3 more minutes, so there's basically time for 1 more question and answer. So if nobody, yes, but
You can say hello from me.
yeah, Batsheva Goldman.
And my question is on the Evernote. Does he see it as a unique manuscript tradition that is between the medieval and the 18th century? In other words, I see the Evernote manuscripts not just related to the printed version, but a unique illustrated continuation of medieval manuscripts, and really the only connecting line between medieval manuscripts and the 18th century Moravian.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard it. Yeah. I'm not sure that I fully agree, but I heard it.
Yeah.
No, what I think is we have to be aware that we're talking about enormous numbers. I've tried together with Benjamin Ritschler to come up with an estimation of the number of manuscripts that we still have today of the post-medieval period, of the period since the invention of printing, and we're probably talking 40 to 50,000 manuscripts. That's enormous. I mean, that is sort of equal to the number of medieval manuscripts that we have. So the manuscript edition was very important alongside the Hebrew printed book tradition. Of course, we're talking about millions of copies of individual printed books, but nevertheless, there are other examples of illustration of manuscripts. I mean, the Sefer Avonot are very important, but for example, the Amsterdam Sfaradim and of the 17th century had a very strong tradition of illustrating their books, both in Hebrew and in Spanish and in Dutch and in Portuguese. So and I actually think that there too, probably under the influence of their original Catholic background, or the semi-original Catholic background, there was also a strong interest in the outer shape of the manuscripts, and I think that the use of the term Baroque is actually very appropriate also when it comes to the later works of the Amsterdam Sfaradim. And these Amsterdam Sfaradim were instrumental in the production of many of the Ketubot with printed borders, especially the Megillot with printed borders. So I think that the city of Amsterdam and the presence of all the printers that basically inspired all the printed books that basically inspired the 18th century school of manuscript production is equally important, and probably a couple of others. I mean, it's very difficult to. This was one group of people who were producing all these items, and they were not only producing printed books. The illustrators of certain painters, Benjamin Senior Godinez in the 17th century is a wonderful example. He did a beautiful Vanitas painting, which is now in the Jewish Museum in London. There are copies of that drawn on parchment in the Rosenthaliana and Eitz Chaim library in Amsterdam. He also did the copper engravings for the title page of Mea Brachot printed in Amsterdam in 1680. So there are many interrelations between the printing trade and the manuscript trade, and these were often the same people. It's a very small group of people. It's the same with the 18th century scribes. So yes, they were aware of the printed book. They were aware of the printed book tradition. They were certainly aware of Sefer Avonot. But I think the overall picture, and I don't even speak about Italy. I mean, the situation in Italy is even more complicated, because also there's so many beautiful illustrated manuscripts, and many of these are just qualified as 18th century Italy. One of the jokes that I always make, if you find in an auction catalog a reference to a manuscript done in 18th century Italy, there are two possibilities. The first is that it was actually done in the 18th century in Italy, and the second is that the people writing it have no clue. Which basically means that you can always, that's a good guess. There were so many manuscripts produced there were so many printed books produced at the same time. So I think the picture is more complex than just a Sefer Avonot, but in principle I do agree that it's a continuous tradition.
Okay, so I think this went wonderfully, and thank you for whoever was involved in the technology. Kol hakavod, Lior. And good to see you, Emile. And we heard you perfectly. It was very clear. It was very well filmed. So that was great. We should do this more often.
We should thank Ardon for that. Ardon programma was my guy.
Good luck.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.